Thank you very much, Madam President and members of Council. I'm David Bulova. I work for Wood, and so we were hired to help facilitate the discussion and conversation about the stormwater fee credit policy. And so it's been an honor to work with your staff and to work with that advisory committee, and very pleased to be able to be here with you all to report out on our draft policy and the credit manual. I will tell you that this is probably a longer presentation than I would normally do, but I'm going to try to run through it really quickly. So please feel free to go ahead and stop me if I start spitting out acronyms or say something that you want me to go ahead and back up on. But just in terms of what we're going to cover today, and if we could go to the next slide. So do want to provide a bit of an overview of the proposed stormwater program and the fee. And then we'll go ahead and jump into the credit policy development process that we put together here for Erie. We'll look at the different considerations, key questions that we had the advisory committee go through and ask. And then we'll run through the actual credit policy that's being proposed for your consideration tonight. We'll apply that to some hypothetical situations so you can see the impact on a property owner for what a credit would mean. And then we'll do a really quick overview of the credit manual. But the credit manual itself has all the same kind of language and policy. It's just put into a version that's a little bit more user-friendly and provides some background on that. So as far as the stormwater program, so again, the focus of what we were working on was not the stormwater program and the fee development. We were working on the credit policy. But I think it is really important to kind of step back and review the program and the fee because it does provide very important context with respect to the credit policy. And so for the next couple of minutes, I just want to run through some of the mechanics of all that.
And just so you know,
yes.
I'm pretty sure Chuck was here last year for some of the discussion, but we have
great.
we have new council members who were here for last year when we were presented with the original fee.
Good. Well, maybe I won't go quite so fast, but yeah. So I think with any effort like this, it's really important to step back and look at what your program goals are. And so in this case, I know the city, as they were considering a stormwater fee, really stepped back and we're looking at what it is that we're trying to accomplish in the city of Erie. And so the big one, obviously, is protecting human health and the environment. I think everybody here knows that your stormwater discharges directly to Lake Erie and Presque Isle Bay, so there's an immediate impact on water quality there. Another one being minimized property loss, as well as damage from flooding, ensuring continued compliance with state and federal regulatory requirements. DEP and EPA don't like to go ahead and use enforcement. They like to have that voluntary compliance. But one of our jobs, of course, is to make sure not to put the city under threat of actually being sanctioned or fined because they can get pretty big. It's $32,500 per day per violation, and so that's something we would never want to put the city in the position of being out of compliance with those regulations. Recognizing that the drainage system is a public asset, it's often described as the silent infrastructure, but it really is very important to the quality of life. And also protecting the economic benefits of Lake Erie. And having been up here for 4 times to meet with the advisory committee, it is a beautiful asset that you have, and I have contributed mightily to the economy of Erie by taking advantage of a couple of your waterside restaurants. Next, all right, so the big question we often get is, why now? What is driving the change at this particular stage of the game? And so there's really 3 points that I wanted to go ahead and make here. So one is aging stormwater infrastructure. And so the city manages, again, a vast network of underground stormwater pipes. It's about 500 miles of stormwater pipes just in the city of Erie. If you put that end to end, you would have a pipe that could stretch all the way from Erie, Pennsylvania to Knoxville, Tennessee. So it is pretty big. Not unlike a lot of other cities, Erie's age, parts of that system are getting pretty old, so 100 years plus. Even really good modern corrugated or reinforced concrete will only last about 100 years if properly maintained. So you've got a lot of infrastructure that is pretty old. You have capacity issues, and so, pipes that were built 100 years ago, 50 years ago, before good stormwater management were typically smaller and not widened as additional development came on. And so what you do is you wind up, the stormwater backs up and causes upstream flooding. And then deferred maintenance costs are more in the long term. And I wanted to go ahead and highlight this really briefly because it's a very important point, which is that managing by emergency is a lot more expensive than rehabilitating and fixing the system before a collapse occurs. And so Fairfax County, Virginia, actually did a really long study to look at kind of the cost of maintenance over time versus the cost of what happens if something goes ahead and collapses. And they found that it was about 7 times more expensive to take care of something after it's gone ahead and collapsed. We went ahead and validated those numbers with city staff with some recent projects and some recent experiences, and the numbers were very similar. And so just 2 examples had it that it was about 5 to 6 times more expensive if you let the pipe collapse than if you had just gone through and rehabilitated the pipe and slip lined it. So those are pretty telling numbers in terms of why it's important to go in and be proactive about the maintenance of the system. More stringent DEP and EPA stormwater requirements. I'll talk about that a little bit more. And then also just increasing public expectations, both residents and businesses, with respect to not wanting to have to delay or have to deal with spot flooding and stuff like that, and also just in terms of the quality of the water in our local streams. So these are just a couple of examples here for Erie. So this is road flooding caused by undersized infrastructure. This is West 12th Street. So that's the kind of nuisance flooding that you go ahead and see, that is a result of undersized infrastructure. Next slide. This is a closed circuit television shot of deteriorated underground pipes under Myrtle Street. And so that's a really great example that if you can catch something like that early, it's relatively inexpensive to go ahead and fix. If you wait for that to collapse, it's going to be a lot more expensive to go ahead and fix. And then you got the next slide. So this is where you did have to go ahead and deal with a collapsed structure. And of course, that was expensive for the city to help manage. Next slide. All right, so in terms of the stormwater permit requirements, and this is important, I guess, to remember because it does come back up with respect to the credit policy. And so the city is subject to a municipal separate storm sewer system permit, which is a state and federal requirement. And it requires you to have a permit for any discharge of stormwater coming out of your stormwater outfalls. What is changing about these permits is that it used to be much more focused on how do you prevent an increase of pollution from new development. And that's important, and that's still part of your program. However, they're really shifting towards how do you actually restore water bodies that have been impaired because you didn't have adequate stormwater infrastructure in the past. That is a much more difficult thing to do, right? Because now you're retrofitting stormwater into your already built urban environment. And so that's more difficult, but that's the path that DEP and EPA are on. The city drains 8 impaired streams, water bodies, and they are impaired for a number of different pollutants, including sediment. And so one of the things in your permit that's required is the development of a pollutant reduction plan that must demonstrate a 10% reduction in sediment pollution from existing conditions in the city. 10% probably doesn't sound like a lot. It is a lot when you go ahead and consider trying to get that infrastructure into that built environment, and compliance by other MS4 permittees and localities typically runs in the millions and millions of dollars. And I think that's the challenge that you're also facing here in the city of Erie. And so this is an example of where some of that sediment comes from, is blown out stream banks. And so as the volume and velocity of that water exceeds the carrying capacity of those streams, the stream banks erode and carry that sediment down into Lake Erie and your local streams. One of the things about your pollution reduction plan is that it does rely a lot on stream restoration projects in order to be able to get to those reductions. And so it's great because you're restoring your streams to a more natural state. But again, that it is going to go ahead and cost money to be able to do that. Next slide. And this one, I love this one because it really just shows how complex and interconnected your stormwater system is. And so it really, again, is a massive system. I know that you all have some money coming in from the federal government that is going towards repairing some of your storm water infrastructure. Those are your light blue areas. The reason why I wanted to highlight that is because it really shows that while that is very important in terms of an infusion of money into infrastructure management, it really touches just a small portion of the city as a whole. Okay, next slide. And so just as far as the program that the fee will ultimately be supporting, so this is above and beyond what you're currently doing. So this is all new program. So $300,000 to $350,000 for operating costs, an engineer and field supervisor. So one of, again, the things that DEP and EPA are really focusing on is making sure that your stormwater infrastructure is being maintained to its original design standards. And so it's really important, and it is a permit requirement, and in fact it's an ordinance requirement that you actually have boots on the ground from city staff going out inspecting those. And so that's what Eric is here to go ahead and largely do, is kind of get that under control and make sure that this infrastructure that's been invested in is actually being maintained and serving its public purpose. Another $420,000 to $480,000 is on planned capital costs, mapping, technology, public education and outreach is a growing element of these permits. And then that last bit is on future priority projects. So this includes those water quality retrofits as well as other things to go ahead and maintain the system in good repair and rehabilitate it. Okay. So this is where the stormwater fee comes in with respect to being an opportunity. And so the basic question, that the city was faced with wasn't whether you needed additional revenue. You do. It's how are those costs going to be distributed among property owners within the city. And so that was kind of the basic question that was being faced by the city in terms of how do you go ahead and raise the revenue in order to invest in your stormwater infrastructure. Next slide. So what is a stormwater utility? So it's both a program and a fee for services. And so it's not unlike your wastewater fee. It's not unlike solid waste fees or water fees. But the idea is rather than charging based on property value, fees are assessed on the impervious cover on a parcel. And so that's kind of a nationally recognized standard for stormwater utilities and fees. And it's a recognition that there is a relationship between the intensity of development on a property and the need for a public stormwater management system. So it has a couple of advantages, at least these are considerations when cities and towns and counties go ahead and implement these. So it is potentially a fairer way to distribute those costs of services, again, because there is that relationship between the development on the property and the public program that doesn't exist with respect to just the value of the property. Everybody benefits from the program, so everybody pays. So this is different than real property taxes where you do have people who are exempt. In this case, you actually kind of widen the pie of who's paying because everybody contributes some level of stormwater into the system and then benefits from that stormwater program. And it's also revenue that's put into a separate enterprise fund. And so it does increase transparency, it does increase accountability because there has to be a relationship between what goes into that enterprise fund and an established need. It is important to note, I just wanted to go ahead and bring this up, that it's not a way of measuring direct runoff from individual parcels, right? So this is a way to distribute costs based on density of development, but we're not going in and deciding how much runoff is coming from each individual parcel. That would be really, really tough to do. It would be very expensive to do. To my knowledge, there aren't other localities that have tried to go down that way. Okay. So in terms of the proposed Erie fee, the city considered a wide range of possible rate structures. So how would you put together a rate for stormwater? And so what the city settled on was a hybrid approach that was based on the best available data on impervious cover. And so again, the quality of that impervious cover is ultimately what's going to be driving the bill. And so the city looked at its resources and said, here's what we think makes sense for the city of Erie. So residential parcels are charged using the building footprint, and that's done in tiers, and I'll explain that in a second. So it's just the building footprint that they're being charged for. All other properties are using actual impervious cover and then charged in billing units. And the reason is that there's so many residential parcels, it would be really tough to go through and QA/QC and make sure that all those sheds and patios and stuff like that were included, where you have a relatively small number of industrial and commercial and institutional properties, and so you are able to go through and QA/QC that information. So the proposed fee, again, for residential is broken into 3 tiers. And so you have your small ones at $12 per year, you got medium at $24, and then you got larger parcels or properties at $36 per year. And then businesses and nonprofits and public entities too. So one of the advantages is that your state and federal government properties also have to go ahead and pay into the system. They're charged in chunks known as billing units or equivalent residential units. And so that is traditionally kind of set on the median impervious cover of a residential property, 2,136 square feet in Erie. And the proposed rate at this point would be $24. So if you have a property with 10,000 square feet of impervious area, divide that by 2,136. You go ahead and round it to the next or the closest whole number. So that's 5 ERUs. They would pay $120 per year. Next slide. Often we are asked, so are other localities in Pennsylvania doing this? The answer is yes. Each of them has come up with a system that they think works for themselves. And so this is just an example of how that has been structured for some of the townships and cities in Pennsylvania. The next slide is going to be more useful because it gives you an example of how does Erie's rate compare to other rates adopted by other municipalities. And so you can see in here, I've taken the mid-level single-family residential property per year, and then what would a non-residential property pay if they had an acre of impervious cover. And so you can see in Erie that tier 2 is $24. If you were non-residential and had 43,550 square feet, it's $480. That is by and far much lower than you would ultimately be paying, except for White Township, which goes ahead and beats you all out. But it's important to kind of demonstrate that the city staff has tried to keep this program lean and mean so that it generates enough revenue, but it also doesn't have a lot of fat on that program. It's meant to get accomplished what needs to get accomplished.
And if you can just refresh us, is there a time period at which this would be in effect? Was it 3 years or?
Right. So, and I'm going to rely on Renee, but I think it was 5 years. Yes. So the way that the rate model was done is that you would hold the rate steady for 5 years. Mm-hmm. You'd see whether you needed to raise that, or you could lower it, or if it could be the same after that 5 years, just to make sure it was matching up with the program. Before we go to the next slide, I did want to highlight kind of another difference in terms of a stormwater fee versus using the real property tax, because it does represent and shift costs in different ways. And so, again, if you take a look at how much does an average residential property go ahead and pay in Erie under a stormwater fee, you're looking at either 12, 24, or 36. According to your finance department, the average residential property, if you were to just increase the real property tax in order to do the same thing and have the same program, it would be $55 per year. So,
and that would be because it would just be for those that pay property taxes. The others would continue to be exempt, correct? Is that why the burden would be larger in terms?
Right.
Okay.
So so two. So what one is that you have more impervious cover that's associated with commercial and industrial, and it's often valued less. And so if you've got a commercial parking lot that's paved but doesn't have anything on it, they're going to be paying relatively little in real property taxes. They'd pay more under a stormwater utility fee. And then as you aptly pointed out, you have more people paying into the system with a stormwater fee, and that keeps the rates down. Okay, next slide. All right, so moving on to the credit policy discussion. And so another advantage of a stormwater fee is the opportunity to provide credits for those who actively manage their stormwater. So that's not something that you would really be able to do if you were charging based on the value of the parcel and using the real property tax, but because it's a fee for service and somebody actively goes ahead and manages their stormwater, localities can go ahead and provide a credit to a property owner who actively does that. And so a credit is a reduction recognizing that active management by a property owner can have a long-term benefit for the public system. It is not a reimbursement, and it is not an exemption, and it can't be arbitrary. You know, and so remember, if you are getting a credit, that means you are paying less. It's a revenue reduction, and so there has to be some public purpose that's attached to that credit, right? So I am paying less because I'm doing something that benefits the public system. But it is something that's nice that you're able to recognize that, you know, this person over here has a stormwater management facility, this person doesn't, and so there's a difference with respect to their impacts on the system. And so just to kind of give you a really high level idea of how that works, is that if you've got a property area of 10,000 square feet, you've got a fee that's based on 7,000 square feet of impervious area. So you're charging based on how much impervious area is on that property. Your stormwater practice treats 1,000 square feet. Your credit is based on that 1,000 square feet, right? And so it's not the whole property, it's how much impervious area are you managing with your stormwater management structure. So that's, yes, sir.
On my property, what do I have to do to obtain credit? What do I have to build something? Something?
Yeah, and actually we'll go through what it is that's being proposed in order to be able to get that. But typically it is something that you do on your property that is physical, that manages or mitigates stormwater impacts in some way.
Commercial properties, or is this available for residents as well?
Well, and that was one of the things that the advisory committee really looked at, and they are recommending a way for residential properties also to get a small reduction on their fees. So that was one of the questions that we asked is, you know, do we want to do that? Ultimately, I love these two slides because it's a really nice juxtaposition. It is a credit is a way to differentiate the fact that this brand new parking lot without any stormwater controls has a different impact on the city system than the next slide, which is a parking lot that has built-in green stormwater infrastructure. And so again, you can kind of see that there's a difference with respect to the benefit to the public system in those cases. So we put together, the city put together a stormwater credit advisory committee. And again, I really enjoyed working with them. They were absolutely fantastic, and they really jumped in and became stormwater experts very, very quickly. And they were charged with helping city staff think through key policy questions with respect to what makes sense for the city of Erie in terms of its credit policy. And so it was a very diverse group of stakeholders on purpose with a wide range of different backgrounds. And they provided just invaluable feedback, you know, as you know, we worked through those policy issues. We weren't able to reach consensus on everything. That's just not the nature of how things work, but we did listen. We did respond and react, and in a lot of cases we were able to come to consensus on a number of the different issues that are out there. These are your intrepid Stormwater Advisory Committee members. So again, thank you to each of them for coming out and spending time with us. There are 12 members. They were all very, very active. And as you can see, you know, they represented everything from engineers to environmental scientists to commercial real estate developers, housing, port authority, wastewater, utilities, just to individual residents who were felt like they could play a role in this, and they certainly did. So anyways, it was a really, really good group of individuals that helped work us through this process. We met 4 times beginning in April, and went through a number of agenda items, and so we reviewed all the different kind of credit tools that might be available to the city. So we put together a toolbox of what other localities in Pennsylvania and beyond have looked at. We talked about the different considerations, pros and cons with different approaches. We identified, what were our goals and priorities, and then got feedback on draft concepts, so that they go ahead and say, yeah, this looks good, or no, people won't like that. And then ultimately, we developed the draft credit manual that you all have before you, and gave them an opportunity to go ahead and read through it. We did take detailed meeting notes of each of the meetings, so if you are interested and want some nice late night reading, we can make those available to you. Next slide. So key policy questions that we walked through. So what types of structural practices should be eligible for credit and under what circumstances? And so I'll explain what a structural practice is. What's the appropriate amount of credit? This often gets the biggest amount of conversation, in terms of, what is this worth to the public system? The boring part is, what kind of documentation and verification has to go along with that. So that's relatively standard. Another one that we had to think through, although it's not all that common in the city, is how to treat condos and homeowners associations where you've got joint ownership of stormwater management facilities. And then to the councilman's question, should everybody have an opportunity to reduce their fee, even if it's by a small amount? And so by that we mean both residential and potentially small business properties as well. And then last but not least, this is a question that came up, is should the total amount of credit be capped each year? And I'll kind of explain the thought process for that one as well. So as we started out, we did have a couple of key considerations that we asked the committee to think about as we were looking at different options. So one is the administrative burden. So the more complex a program, the more time, energy, and effort it takes with respect to administrative oversight. And so you can come up with some really creative programs, but we were always trying to keep it in the back of our minds, which is it worth having a half FTE, a full FTE, multiple FTEs having to manage a credit program and diverting resources away from the stormwater program itself. So that was a big consideration, is, what is the administrative oversight? Equity, so not all of these stormwater structures do the same things. Some localities differentiate localities based on whether they do more for water quality or do more for flooding or a combination. But again, the more you differentiate, the more complex the program gets. We talked about shifting costs. So the more credit means less revenue, which means that there's upward pressure on the rate for the long time. And so you get to that 5-year period. If you have a lot more credits, there's a higher chance that you're going to have to say, ooh, that $12, $24, $36 isn't cutting it. We might have to raise rates for everybody. Verification and enforcement. So again, this is a credit you're getting for something that benefits the system, and so it needs to be verifiable. And then finally, which is, what are the public's expectations? What does the public want out of this program? And that's a perfectly good thing to go ahead and consider, as long as there's a nexus between the credit and the stormwater program. We did try to make it interactive. I don't know if I could use the word fun, but we did try to make it interactive by having some dot voting exercises. And so one of the facilitation techniques is, we would sometimes do a round robin just to make sure everybody chimed in. But we also had a lot of these questions. We were like, we want you to think through and say, I like this idea, I hate this idea, or this is an idea that maybe has some potential, right? And so we actually put the questions up on the wall, and people had their green, red, and yellow sticky dots to go ahead and put it up there. And actually that helped to really drive a lot of the conversation, because it gave us a clear sense of where the advisory committee was going on a couple of these big issues. All right, so I'm going to walk you through the questions that we had, and this really kind of feeds, the answers to the questions really are your credit policy. And so what practices should receive credit? And so in this manner, we're talking about traditional stormwater structures. So these are engineered practices, usually put in as a condition of development and meet DEP or city design standards. They differ, in terms of quality versus quantity. And up until recently, quite honestly, if this was a conversation 5 or 10 years ago, these were the only kind of structures that would be typically eligible for credit. Next slide. But this gives you an idea of what they look like. So this is a condition of development example. So this was put in as a result of your Act 167 requirements. It's a new stormwater detention pond at berm embedding. So something like that could receive credit. Next one. So this is also a condition of development. This is an underground infiltration system that was put in with the new sheets, right? So one was an above ground. This one you can go ahead and put underneath a parking lot, but both put in for regulatory compliance with Act 167 requirements. Next one. This one's a little bit different. So this is an example from something that the Port Authority has put in. So this is called a snout oil water debris separator. Try saying that 3 or 4 times really fast. But whereas your other facilities were put in to control nutrients and sediment and stuff like that, these were put in to control hydrocarbons and trash and debris. But again, you are actively managing stormwater, and so something like this could potentially be eligible for credits. Next one. All right, so the credit advisory committee actually came to some pretty good consensus on this. I won't say it was unanimous, but the overall sense of the committee was keep it simple. And so traditional structures they thought should receive one level of credit. So notwithstanding whether you might have a bioretention facility that reduces a little bit more pollution than a detention facility, the idea is that they were all put in there with the idea in mind of compliance with regulations and mitigating the impacts of development. The exception is providing additional credit for a facility that achieves sediment reduction 10% or greater than what's required for regulatory compliance. And so the logic behind that is that, all right, you all are under the gun to reduce your sediment by 10% to meet regulatory requirements. If you can get somebody to build their structure bigger in order to be able to get additional sediment reduction, you get to take credit for that. That's a cost avoidance, right? So that's actually worth something tangible to the city. And so the advisory committee felt that, yes, in those circumstances, they should get extra credit. Okay. As far as credit eligibility, again, a little on the boring side, but it does have to meet technical standards. So if you don't know what technical standard it's meeting, it's really hard to verify that it's doing what it's supposed to do. Always subject to a maintenance agreement. And so this is something that's required in your permit. Some of your old facilities might not have them in place, and so making sure that there's an agreement, a legally enforceable agreement with the property owner that they're going to go ahead and maintain that. And then also a way to verify that the structure is being maintained. If a property owner is abiding by their maintenance agreement, that verification isn't really tough because that's what you're going to be doing year in and year out anyway. So those are kind of your 3 things to be eligible for the credit. You have to meet a technical standard, have to have a maintenance agreement, has to be verified as functioning as originally designed. Okay, next one. So the next one is how much credit should be received. And this one, it's interesting because there was also, I think, a decent amount of consensus from the advisory committee on this one. So it does have to be linked with a benefit. That benefit can be quantitative and that benefit can be qualitative, as long as you're able to go ahead and articulate why it is that you provided the credit that you went ahead and provided. So the benefit of those structural controls that are put in for regulatory requirements is mostly to mitigate flooding and water quality degradation from the property. So it doesn't impact maintenance of your existing system, doesn't impact the fact that you've got to go back in and make sure those pipes are structurally sound. And so when you take a look at your future programs, so not just your immediate needs, but what you're doing in the future, about 25% of your future focuses on improvements that could be influenced by one of these stormwater structures, as opposed to maintenance and rehabilitation, which has to happen regardless of what is occurring on your property. And so that 25% was kind of your key marker to say that makes sense in terms of a number as far as a credit, an initial credit for a stormwater management structure. In terms of the voluntary sediment reduction, that's cost avoidance. A lot of what you're spending money on in the future of that 25% is going to be on those water quality improvements. And so we again use that as kind of our key benchmark for, what was this worth to the city's program. So next slide. And so that's what we came up with. So 25%, if you have a structure that's put in place, it meets those technical standards, you're maintaining it, you get 25% credit. If you expand it or enlarge it to be able to reduce sediment by more than 10%, you get a 20% bonus on top of that. So your total possible credit on your bill would be 45%. And if you take a look at what other localities in Pennsylvania have done, we kind of fall squarely within that particular area. So you've got a low of 35% in Bethlehem as their max, and then Allentown and Bradford and Easton go up to 50%, but it puts you in that area. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay. So with regard to reasonable documentation and verification, so again, you need to make sure that it's operating as designed. The nice thing is we got Eric out there who is going to be validating whether something is actually operating as designed. And so as long as a structure passes a city inspection, then you're in good shape, right? So the application is going to say, all right, show us that you've actually maintained this. And then there on out, as long as it continues to pass city inspection, you should be good to go. And so that's actually a benefit of another area that you're investing in, is that that these should actually be in good shape. Next slide. So there will be an application form. We've tried to keep it really simple. We'll go through that at the very end. You need to submit your maintenance agreement. You should have that on file along with your as-built structures and proof that you've gone ahead and maintained it. And so those are the things that would be in your application package. Next slide. If you don't have those things, city staff will try to find them. If they cannot find them, you then need to enter into a maintenance agreement. That's pretty simple. And then you have to come up with at least some kind of structure report and map that shows, through engineering, that here's the structure, here's what kind of structure it is, here's how much impervious area it drains, because that's what you're going to be basing your calculation on. And it has to be certified by an engineer. Next slide. As far as applications, so they can be submitted at any time, rolling applications, but any application received before or on July 1st will be applied to the next billing cycle. So the billing cycles are proposed to start in January, and so anything in the door by July 1 gives the city enough time to verify the application and that everything is in good order, and then you apply that credit to the next billing cycle. And then, as I mentioned, is that renewal is automatic, provided that it passes city inspection. If it doesn't pass city inspection, the city will say, hey, you've got X number of months to go ahead and bring this back up to standards, or else you ultimately lose your credit. Next. I won't spend too much time on this one, but this is just how the city treats condos and homeowners associations. Also applies to business parks or industrial parks where you might have common ownership in a stormwater management facility, and those stormwater management facilities are usually owned or operated by the property manager or the HOA or the condo association. And so this kind of illustrates you got a pond that drains an area that includes common area that owns the people who own the pond, and then you've got people who belong to that association who help pay for the maintenance of that pond, who are both inside and outside. And then you got people who are actually inside and draining to it who don't belong to that association. So how do you untangle that web? The easiest way, if I can go to the next slide, is really to have the association that owns the structure actually go ahead and pay the entire fee for the association. So they look at the association boundaries, how much impervious area is in the association, and then they get to take full credit for that stormwater management facility. So it would be something that they would decide that they would want to do. It's a way to maximize the credit for their members, but they would be responsible for taking in the whole bill, They would then get the credit, and then they would decide how they wanted to distribute those benefits back out to their members. So it would be an internal thing. The city could say, it's up to you guys how you want to go ahead and do that. But it's a clean, easy way of dealing with a complicated situation, which is let the HOA figure out how they want to go ahead and deal with those costs and divide up the benefits of the credit.
Question?
Yes, sir.
Will this apply to authorities? Port Authority, Water Authority, Housing Authority?
It applies to everybody, yes, sir. And it is a fee for service, right? And so similar to other ones where we've got fees, they also have to go ahead and pay. It's also instrumental in that if the city or any locality starts to exempt their own properties or other public properties, they could go ahead and say that it's arbitrary, and they wouldn't have to go ahead and pay under state and federal law. And so it's kind of an all-in approach.
And would that also apply to 501c3?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yep.
Question.
Yes.
So places like Port, and I know the hotels that have their own brand, how will most of that be addressed by them putting in for credits, or would theirs be based on the same rates as everyone else? Because obviously they have their own system, address that.
So yes, so they would be charged just like anybody else, but they also would be eligible just like anybody else for credits for stormwater management facilities that are put on their property where they're actively managing that stormwater. So they would be treated just like an industrial property or other commercial property. Okay, next slide. Oh, there we go. So this is the one, to your point, which is, should everybody have an opportunity to reduce their fees? And so up until now, we've been talking about relatively large structures that serve big residential development, industrial areas, businesses, things like that. Again, up until recently, those were usually the only things that were eligible for credit. However, there's been a trend where residential properties, small businesses, have been interested in saying, hey, I would like an opportunity as well in order to be able to receive some kind of credit. And so the question is, do we want to provide credit for something that can be more broadly implemented to help engage people in the program? And there are some very helpful practices out there that do help water quality. The problem is that they are really hard to quantify, and the city can't take credit for them under your MS4 permit. Some of them, if you're not careful, can also become nuisances if they're not maintained properly. And so there's a lot of vegetative practices that look great when they're first designed. They're not going to look so great if the property owner doesn't go ahead and take care of them. So you just have to be a little careful. So really kind of two categories that we really looked at. And so we went through kind of the pros and cons of each of these approaches with the advisory committee. Rain barrels, rain gardens, pervious pavement, if you're familiar with that, which allows water to soak through, a deck or a patio. They can sometimes be problematic because they clog up. Tree planting and stuff like that. So those are small projects converting land uses. The next one are pollution prevention activities. So street sweeping, pet waste stations have been used in some localities. Nutrient management, or even just getting out there and volunteering in the community. There's been a couple of ones where, if you volunteer a certain number of hours, you can get a credit off those. And so again, we looked at kind of that toolbox. We looked at the pros and cons. We looked at the benefits to the city. We looked at the administrative burden. And what the advisory committee really kind of honed in on was that they largely agreed that everybody should have some opportunity to be able to reduce their fee. However, they really wanted the practices to be substantive and have a real impact. And they were also very cognizant, and I know city staff was very, very happy to hear this. They were very cognizant of the administrative impact on city staff in terms of managing these things. The other really big discussion that the advisory committee had was the fact that you are applying a credit to a fee that is already very, very low, right? And so, you know, if you're paying $12 or $24 or $36 per year, you're not likely to install something based on an economic benefit, right? I want to be a good steward, and this is a way to go ahead and recognize that, even if it's a very small fee or a small credit. So there were two practices that rose to the top. So rain gardens and then infiltration trenches and dry wells. So next slide. So the pros of rain gardens is they can be implemented by a wide range of homeowners. They do have tangible benefits. Again, you just can't take credit for them, you know, but they are a demonstrated water quality technology. They can be aesthetically pleasing if they are well maintained. And there's lots of good technical guidance on there. So we're not reinventing the wheel. And in fact, the city has a very straightforward guidance policy already put in place to calculate, you know, how big your rain garden has to be for a certain area. So next one. And in case you're not familiar with rain gardens, they are basically like a giant sponge in your yard. And so you dig out the existing soil that's usually pretty hardened in an urban environment. You go ahead and fill that up with a soil media that's going to be mulch, it's going to be sand, it's going to be other things that allows water that comes into it to go ahead and soak into it. And it stores it until it can soak into the ground. And so it reduces the amount of runoff coming from the property. It also allows those pollutants to filter into the ground. Next slide. Dry wells and infiltration trenches are very similar. Except that instead of filling them up with soil and planting them on top, you fill them up with different size types of gravel and sands and put kind of a geofabric around it. The nice thing about these, even though they're not quite as aesthetically pleasing, is you can get them into narrower spots or tight spaces, such as the edges of driveways and small parking lots. And the city also has sizing calculations that enables a property owner to pretty easily decide how big one of these need to be.
Yeah, that's good. Looks like it's a final product. Actually, I'm not going to do this.
Yeah, well, it would be cleaned up a little bit better than that. But yeah, generally you're going to have, you know, gravel on the top, and you know they can be round like that. They can be really, really narrow. So yeah, that's basically what they look like. Okay, next slide. The tougher conversation though was how much credit should you get? And again, with the backstop that almost there's no credit that you could possibly give that is going to make it so that a property owner is going to say, this is, well, I'm going to make just a ton of money off of putting in this infiltration trench. The real benefit, you know, and again, I think the advisory committee was just being very honest with itself, is the educational impacts, right? And so people see it, they're like, ooh, what's that? That's cool. Oh, that's to manage your stormwater. They start to make a link between what happens on their property, you know, to, you know, what happens, you know, to the natural environment. As far as the benefit is concerned, though, only about 10% or less of your program deals with public education and outreach. Really, it's really very swamped by a lot of those, you know, larger infrastructure projects. And so ultimately, they came to the conclusion that, you know, it's worth about a 10% credit on your property. And again, realizing anybody who's going to do it is going to do it out of the goodness of their own heart.
So do I have to fill out paperwork for that $3.60 credit? Does the city inspect that?
So next slide. So yes, we wanted to make the application and renewal process as simple as humanly possible, realizing that you still wanted it to be tangible. And so if you put one of these things in, usually you're going to have a contractor who's going to go ahead and design it and put it in for you. All we're asking is that you have an engineer or a landscape architect or soil and water conservation professional who is familiar with these go ahead and sign a certification saying, yep, this has been designed appropriately. And then the credit would be simply renewed each year. You go ahead and submit a photo and say, yes, I still have and I'm maintaining this on my property. So we didn't want to make it overly cumbersome. But again, you are receiving a benefit, and so we wanted to make sure that, you know, it was indeed a rain garden, something that was designed to mitigate water quality. All right, next one. And so I think this is the last question that we had, which is, should the total amount of credit be capped each year? And so in the proposed budget, there is $50,000 put in for credits. And I think the concern was, what if everybody came in and you had $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 worth of credits coming in the door? All of a sudden, all of your program is being done through credits and not going to the program. Now, I will tell you, based on experience, that's likely not going to happen. A lot of people aren't going to apply. It's not worth their time and effort. But I think there was a recognition that we wanted there to be a little bit of a fail-safe to ensure that, you know, we were keeping within budget in terms of credits. And so this is something that we actually, I won't say stole, we borrowed from Meadville. And so their credit policy basically says that if your total amount of credit approved for a year exceeds the amount that is set by your city council and budget, then everybody's credit is actually reduced by a prorated amount, right? And so, you know, if you're eligible for $100, you know, your cap is $50,000, but your total credits for the year come in at $70,000, everybody has to go ahead and reduce their credit by a small amount in order to be able to keep under that $50,000 mark. And by and large, the advisory committee understood that logic and supported that logic, just to make sure that we were focusing the program on the infrastructure. Okay, next slide. So just really quickly, some credit examples so you can get an idea of the order of magnitude for these. So this is a stormwater structure on a non-residential hypothetical property. And so in this case, you've got a total impervious area of 20,000 square feet. You are treating 15,000 square feet with a bioretention swale. You also got a neighboring property over there that may or may not be draining into that. And so for the first example, next slide. So let's say that you just got a regular old humdrum facility. It was put in for regulatory compliance. You get 25% credit. Your original fee would have been $216. Your reduced fee is going to be $175.50. So that kind of gives you an idea of your order of magnitude for something like that. Next slide. So in this case, you got your base credit, but this person oversized their facility a little bit in order to be able to get that 10% reduction in sediment above what was required. So they get that extra 20%, so 45% credit on the treated area. So that goes from $216 to $143 per year. So now it's starting to add up into real money. Next one. So something that we didn't go ahead and talk about, but is in the credit policy, is that you can take credit for off-site treatment. And so a lot of times you'll have a stormwater structure that treats water from your property, but water, like air, doesn't necessarily respect parcel boundaries, and so you might be treating something from your neighbor. And so that again is a benefit to the city. And so what we've said is that you can take a credit for that up to the maximum of 45%. So in this case, you got a base credit facility, but you're treating impervious area from a much bigger area than your property. And so in this case, you get to take that 25% credit, but for more impervious area. And so in this case, you'd go from $216 to $162. Next slide. Here's an example of your rain garden. And we had to kind of pick a threshold. You can't go ahead and plop a rain garden in a yard that's the size of this table and decide that you're going to go ahead and take the credit. There is a sizing criteria, so 50% of the runoff coming from your building footprint. Relatively simple calculation that you have to go through to figure out how big that rain garden needs to be. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see that if you got a 1,000 square foot residential building footprint, so that's your tier 1, your rain garden would have to be approximately 10 by 10 square feet in order to be able to get the credit, and you would get $1.20 on your thing. So again, remember, labor of love, labor of love. Your middle tier, so that's going to be about a 15 by 10, so you're going to get $2.40 off, and for your upper tier, that would be about a 20 by 10 size rain garden, and then you get $3.60 off of that. Next slide. All right, so just to wrap it up, for the credit manuals, we didn't need to reinvent the wheel. Every one of those programs that we looked at also had manuals, and so we combed through there and we went ahead and kind of looked through what we liked, what we didn't like, as far as readability and flow. And so, we went ahead and put all those together and tried to come up with something that made sense for Erie. The advisory committee reviewed that, came up with what I thought was some really good suggestions in terms of readability, adding a glossary of terms, some additional detail about how the stormwater fee is calculated, and then some electronically fillable forms just to make it as convenient as possible for somebody to do that application. It's organized around a couple key concepts. So what is the fee? What is the credit program? How do you get it for structures and water quality projects? The annual cap, and then the forms. And these are what your credit forms look like. Again, we tried to keep them as simple as possible, and then you would attach additional information if you needed it. Next slide. And this is the rain garden infiltration trench form. And again, it's just a matter of, did you size it correctly? And then the most important thing is that last one, which is you got some kind of qualified individual who can say, yeah, this was designed to standards. So I guess just appeals process. Not a lot of discussion about this because it really is captured in the proposed ordinance. And usually they're very straightforward, right? And so in terms of reasons that you can appeal a stormwater fee, they're relatively limited, right? And so you say, I don't have that much impervious cover on my property. You want to challenge that. I think this credit was misapplied, or I didn't get a credit applied to my property and I thought I should, or this is sent to the wrong person, or this isn't my property, right? So all relatively simple stuff. But they just need to be submitted and appealed before May 15th. They go to City Public Works to go ahead and review that. They got 30 days to go back. And again, a really simple appeals form. It's pretty straightforward usually. Once city staff looks and sees it, they can do the forensics of impervious cover and all those kind of things. All right, next slide. All right, and so just to really summarize, so again, the advisory committee provided really great feedback, really appreciate their work on that. It is a pretty straightforward approach, so again, 25% credit for structures built to DEP or city specifications, additional 20% for voluntary sediment reduction for a maximum of 25 or 45%, which is generally in line with other localities. Again, there is an opportunity for all property owners to be able to get some kind of credit with regard to rain gardens and infiltration trenches. And we've tried to also keep it simple by taking advantage of the city's inspection program for the verification process so that your property owner isn't having to do redundant processes. And that's it. And very happy to take any questions.
Okay, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
We talk about the footprint in the billable units. Like obviously for most single-family homes, we're using whatever the actual square footage is. Is that?
So for single-family homes, you're using the building footprint only. So it's too complicated, at least right now, without spending a lot of money to try to make sure we're capturing every patio or every shed. So it's just your actual building footprint that we had really good information on.
Okay, right. So a couple questions without complicating things. So say I have a tri-level. Mm-hmm. Theoretically speaking, I would have a smaller footprint than someone who lives in a ranch, has the same amount of square footage. And from a commercial side, if I have a 10-story building that's 100 by 100, would it be getting the same rate as a person who has $1 million worth or 1 million square foot of impact?
I wish I had brought my example from the city of Rockville, Maryland, because it's a really good example. But you're absolutely correct, right? So the more efficient that you use your space, right? And so if you've got a property that, whether it's commercial or residential, that spreads out and has lots of impervious cover, where you're going to generate stormwater runoff, they're going to pay more than a property that's more efficient, so that your footprint is smaller and you go ahead and build up.
Oh, so that square footage isn't like what I have listed on my property tax.
It's literally the outline of your building.
Just square footage of the first floor.
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah. 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 Not your,
$12 a year.
So you're 24.
right, yeah, so it's not the square footage of living space, it's the square footage of your building footprint, right, if you were looking straight down. Yes, great question, and thank you for asking that.
And I did have a question also, though. You mentioned order of magnitude, and when we first started talking about this last year, there, of course, was a lot of alarm, and I think maybe this is more a question of communication, because there were just light bulbs going off here among city council members. But do we emphasize that this is not a huge burden on residential property owners? I mean, we had people coming up, oh, you know, little old ladies, how are they going to be able to afford this? But the maximum for a residential property would be $36 a year for, did you say? 5 years. So I guess I'm just more articulating what I think we have to emphasize to people. But you could reduce it if you put it in a rain garden and get your, you know, $1.20, $2.40, or $3.60 credit every year. If you.
Right. But yeah, and your public outreach and your messaging is going to be different for each locality, you know, but that is something, you know, that I know was purposeful about the way that the city was proposing this, was to keep the residential fees relatively low.
And I think one of the good things, you talked about the quality of those who were on the advisory council. So maybe Renee could just articulate for those who are listening how those members, I think you actually asked for applications. Yeah. So you had people, you had environmentalists, you had, I noticed an industry person on there, I think from Berry Global. So you had people who applied to serve on that committee, correct?
Yes.
Okay. It was a really interesting cross-section of people when I'm looking at that with background, so.
Yeah, and they did not come for the snacks. I kept bringing them and nobody touched them.
Yeah, they didn't want to eat. Yeah, they just wanted to talk.
What snacks did you have?
I thought they were
What's
good.
your secret? How about, does the Public Works Department have anything to add or any questions for council?
I'd just like to add that when we talk about single-family residential units, the impervious surface was, like David had said, the impervious surface was calculated just off the size of the roof, the building footprint. It did not include impervious surface like driveways, sidewalks, or if you had a patio or a back porch. So that's really important to consider when you discuss how the fee structure was set up.
AJ, did you have an example of Garrison Run, what it ended up costing us? You had that with you?
Yeah, so David had indicated in one of his slides that the cost of emergency repairs versus the cost of planned repairs is significantly different. So just based off of rounded numbers, the square footage cost of the Frontier lumber at East 5th Street collapsed. That included the shoring, the rebuilding of the pipe, the concrete pipe that was replaced the corrugated metal pipe that failed, and then the slip lining to reinforce the pipe that was also deteriorated. On rough numbers, actually very accurate numbers, was $3,500 per foot for that repair. A planned rehabilitation of Garrison, Lower Garrison underneath Soldiers and Sailors Home, which was roughly 800 feet, that cost roughly $800 per square foot, for a linear foot. So you're talking 436 feet was $3,500, was one per foot. That was $1.6 million for 436 feet, and then the planned 800 feet was $650,000. So it's immensely different. And a plan that we're working on, a project that we're currently scoping, is Garrison Run from 5th to 12th Street, which is almost 2,800 linear feet, is roughly $1.6 million. So for 436 foot of an emergency, we're going to get the same amount of value for 1.6 million, which is 2,800 linear feet. So the ability to plan is essential in order to utilize these funds correctly and efficiently, and make sure that you make the most impact when needed.
I think the scary thing about the Frontier Lumber was also that there was a residential property
Absolutely.
that was occupied, so there could have been a substantial human cost there also when
Absolutely.
you have something collapse.
It's a silent.
And the business was affected too. But
It's mostly beneath your feet, and
Yeah.
we don't really, a lot of people are unaware that when they're driving or where they're living at, there's stormwater lines that run underneath their properties, underneath our roads, and they all feed to Presque Isle Bay and Lake Erie, which are essential to Erie and what Erie is about. And we think it's very, very important.
And Renee, do you have a timeline for when the ordinance would be presented to council?
We're ready to go when you are, so, we could do it later this month or next month, whatever you guys feel comfortable with. If you have any other questions, we can answer.
Will this apply to vacant lots or the lots folks
No impervious
purchased
surfaces.
for $250?
So the way that the ordinance is structured is it's applied to a developed lot. A developed lot is anything over 500 square feet. So if it's vacant or has just a very small amount, a minute amount, then it's not gonna get built. So yeah, not applied to vacant lots.
Okay. Well, I think the public should be made aware of that when they decide to purchase a lot. Or some say they purchase it and plan to build on it. So they need to be aware of this program.
I have a couple questions, actually for our Public Works. We saw the breakdown of how the funds were going to be used. So is that 350 for 1 or 2 employees?
The 350,000 would be for 2 employees. Our stormwater engineer is currently being paid out of the general fund, and we would hire an additional field supervisor, and both of those employees would be paid out of the stormwater fund.
Okay. Well, that seems, I don't know what the general is. It seems a little high for 2 persons. Other thing, so I know when we talked the city put booms in on the west side creeks, so have they taken those measures on the east side? And if not, do they plan on doing it?
Yes, we currently have 1 litter boom on Mill Creek, adjacent to the wastewater treatment plant at 68 Port Access Road. And Garrison, is it Garrison or McDaniel? We have a $350,000 grant from the Environmental Protection Agency to add 2 additional litter collection devices on Garrison Run, which runs adjacent to the Port Access Road, north of the Bayfront.
Well, there's also, going further over, there's also, 5 Mile Creek, 3 Mile Creek, or any plans for where that inlets? I know it comes across from possibly Harbor Creek in Wesleyville, but it runs out into Lake here in Erie.
We are looking at the possibility of purchasing property on 20th and June Street, which we'd create a riparian buffer, a natural BMP to purify the water up there, but that's still in the early discussion stage.
It's right by Mo's house.
Oh, and so I do think we need a lot of outreach too, but it would be my hope that after the first year or so that some of the outreach could go back toward the capital projects. It's So it seems like it would be, it's a little out of bounds, but I don't know what you all have to do. But so it would seem like once we get awareness out there that we would be able to put more than half of the money toward the actual projects.
Why is 500 the minimum development? Is that a particular?
It's not a house.
Yeah, generally speaking, 250 to 500 square feet is, much smaller than you'd find in a house. It also has to do with the way things happen with rounding. And so the 500 is generally a relatively reasonable way of differentiating between a developed parcel and non-developed parcel. But there's no magic to it.
Okay. I ask because, in particular, I mean, that's one of the things we talked about with the residential code that I emailed you with the Appendix Q, is that under 500 at 400 is the spot where some of those buildings would be developed. So you'd be able to put in houses that would get in under this, as a pretty common trend right now with some of the development that's happening.
I couldn't tell them about my problem.
Right. We did the math on that.
Frank, can you see, or Jasmine is on, does she have any questions in the chat or live?
I don't have any questions. I've been listening. I'm in favor of the stormwater fee because it's needed for the environment. We're on the lake, so we have to make sure we're prioritizing that.
Okay.
Mr. Keys, just to clarify something you asked earlier about the $350,000 for employee costs. That's not only the cost for the 2 employees, but a vehicle, the necessary technology that they need in the field to complete the job, and it's just not salary and benefits.
Renee, do you have anything to add? Is everybody ready to get out and enjoy the rest of the beautiful night?
I hear there's a concert going on a block away.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Wait, thank you so much.
Really
Appreciate it.
this.